No, why do we need this? And so I will take some time talking about like history and everything like this. And a lot of this information just kind of is based on some of my master's thesis, which was around the portrayal of Indigenous people in K-12 schools. So I'm going to do a couple of things first, and I am going to ask a couple of times for people to write some things in the chat, just so kind of interact with folks. That's the educator in me. So I guess first off, I like to show this map to begin with. It is a map of the area, which I know people are from all over the state, but the area that I live in, Teejope, and this is a map of the attempted forced removal of the Ho-Chunk Nation throughout its history with their interaction with the United States government. And as you can see, we're forced into various reservations throughout the upper Midwest, and many making their way back, and many staying, right? Despite the forced removal. So that's actually why today there are technically two Ho-Chunk nations federally recognized by the tribe, recognized by the federal government, with one being in Nebraska, as you can see here, as well as the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, which is what we know of it today. So I just want to take a moment to mention that. Oh, I'm going to time myself too, so I don't go too long here. Got to set my timer. All right, so I was actually, no, I'm glad that it was mentioned. I had put the slide in today because for those who don't know Ada Deer, I know she was already mentioned, and I would deeply encourage folks who don't know Ada Deer to look her up. There was a great biography that came out about her a couple years ago. Obviously, she's here. She's from Wisconsin. She's part of the Menominee Nation. The biggest kind of victory of her life being the experience of termination in 1954, which officially terminated and got rid of the Menominee Nation as it existed, to fighting for that restoration in the 1970s. And so just want to take a moment to recognize her. Very important, obviously, to the state of Wisconsin, but also to the nation, and to her, more specifically her nation, the Menominee Nation. So if you do not know anything about her, do a quick Google search, right? So, all right. So I want to get up the chat here, because I'm going to be asking you guys to do something in the chat. Hold on a second here. Okay. All right. So I want folks in the chat right now. For some reason, I can't open the chat. Hold on a second. Sorry. I want to make sure I can access this chat. Give me a second here. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll just do this to begin with. All right, so the first question here, people just throw it out in the chat. So what's the first thing that you think of when you think of Indigenous people? Just throw it out in the chat. Citizens of stolen land, okay. Now, and even like as you are thinking about this, what are some of the maybe first images that you thought of when you were a kid, right? When you were younger, right? Not even like things that maybe you think of now. Octave Flambeau, okay. Enemy, ooh, yeah, okay. And as people are typing, maybe where were some of these images that you know? Where'd you get these images? Where'd they come from? TV, okay. Movies, okay, all right. Teepees, of course, teepees, yep. All right, okay, cool. We'll come back to that. All right, so anyone, now we're gonna do a numbers game. Does anyone just want to take a guess? No Googling. How many Indigenous nations there are federally recognized by the U.S. government? And I'm not going to say the answer until the end here. 5 by 780, 535. Okay. Got a wide variety. All right. The next, and I'll come back to say what it is. And how many Indigenous nations are there in the state of Wisconsin? 14, 12. Okay, cool. All right, cool. And now, I kind of said this, with where did you learn this information? Did you learn this in K-12 schools at all? Or was this your own research? So guessing my own research. No, it didn't. Okay. 4, 6. Okay, class through university. Okay, seeing university. All right. So first off, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. In Wisconsin, a lot of you got this right. There's 11 federally recognized tribes, but 12 tribes in the in Wisconsin. One is not federally recognized, and so that's a whole can of issues that we're not gonna get into right now. But actually, Wisconsin has the most indigenous nations within its state that is east of the Mississippi. So it's really important to our states specifically, but obviously the country in general. But as you can see, my point here is none of you said, "Oh yeah, I learned this in high school. I learned this in U.S. history 101 or something like that." Okay, so we're gonna kind of talk about why. Okay, so I do want to do a kind of a note on language, because language is weird and complicated and changes over time. So there's obviously many different terms that people who are the first inhabitants of a land, of any land, that is, but specifically we're talking about the United States, and we're going to be talking, the North America here. But here in the United States, a lot of terms that are used are Native American, Native American Indian, First Nation, Aboriginal, Indigenous, and many of these can be problematic, right? They can be shortcomings, and usually it's based on the relationship to the dominant society. But with that all being said, just like to be clear, I'm going to be using the word Indigenous. I might be using some of these other words as well occasionally, but it's this is just more of a word of advice. It's always best to be specific, right, about someone's nation, whether it's like Lakota, Ho-Chunk, Ojibwe, Onondaga, any of these. So they just want to do that note on language, because language is complicated and changes over time, right? And as we kind of know, as we learn, and as communities advocate for themselves. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of outline what I'm going to talk about here today. So first, before we talk about anything, it's important to really recognize this word settler colonialism or settler colony. The United States was founded as a settler colony, and like, what does that mean, right? What is that? What is the simplistic kind of Cliff Notes version of it is that it's really the both, I would say, the policy and the ideology of removing a population and replacing it with a new population from somewhere else, right? That's the bare bones, right? And I said policy and ideology, because this can take different forms, right? This can take the forms of massacres that we've talked about, or the actual physical relocation, or it could be the integration or the assimilation that we might talk about as well. That's kind of the ideological part. But it is important to note, like, we say, United States, land of the free, home of the brave, but also a settler colony, right, from the very get-go of it. We're going to talk a little bit about and like how that's connected to like schools and boarding schools. Talk about mascots and stereotypes of Indigenous people. I'm actually glad no one said like no mascots, but like mascots is a way in which people see Indigenous people, and we're going to talk about that, how that affects in schools. I'm going to talk about kind of the way Indigenous people have been represented in schools, textbook standards, and this one specifically, which is really important, that overwhelmingly we see Indigenous people represented in schools and textbooks and standards and everything in a pre-1900 context. So obviously in the past and not in the present, living and breathing. And then I'll talk a little bit about legislation, and specifically Act 31, right? Why did Act 31 come about? What does it say? What are some of the limitations? And then kind of ending on some of the efforts, that myself, and I see some people on the call that I know as well, I've been doing in McFarland, to kind of show what we've been doing as like kind of a microcosm example of some sort. All right. So I want to start out, like when we talk about education, one of the first things that I think about when we talk about Indigenous education in its relationship to Western society is boarding schools, missions and boarding schools. And it's important to understand that boarding schools, which were a U.S. policy and also a Canadian policy and policy of other settler colonies as well, as the U.S. continued to fight wars moving west, right? We saw massacres, removals, and everything, treaties signed, which are legally binding documents. We saw a shift, right? A shift that someone would argue was the quote unquote liberal strategy at this time, right? I was like, hey, we don't want to have these violence anymore, but instead we're going to quote unquote civilize Indigenous people, right? This wasn't exclusive to just Indigenous people here. It was in Canada, but also in places like when the U.S. was occupying the Philippines. But the idea was to assimilate, right? To bring the Indigenous person into Western society. And obviously the simplistic of it was the idea of kill the Indian, save the man. And what that means is obviously what that looked like, I should say, is, not allowing you to learn your language, or speak your language, you'll be beaten, or not allowed to dress the way you would like. You can see these pictures where, these were an effort to advertise the success of these schools. And so by the 1920s, about 80% of Indigenous youth attended boarding schools in U.S. and Canada. And there were 11 in Wisconsin. And it wasn't until the 1970s that Indigenous people Indigenous nations started to have agency over their own education in a formal sense, right? Obviously, Indigenous people are always educating the next generation, but this legacy is so important because when you start thinking about schooling, we have to think this is the first interaction with Western education. I emphasize Western education because Indigenous nations educated themselves, right? Western education is this, right? Which is traumatic for most Indigenous folks. And so there's this historical trauma that kind of lives on today. So this is important context for us kind of understanding this. And I apologize if I'm going to zip through some of this. I kind of want to cover as much as I can. Stereotypes, right? No, some of you mentioned you knew some of this stuff because of TV and movies, but also mascots, right? Mascots, fortunately, looking at this image here, 2 of the 5 mascots here have since been eliminated, right? And that's only in recent years, right? A study in 2018, Reclaiming Native Truth, said 72% of people rarely encounter or receive information about Indigenous people. So this can lead to the idea that all Indigenous people are gone from the past, right? And therefore, many non-Indigenous people might only see a mascot as the representation that they know of, right? And this studies had continued to show the negative effects on Native people. And in movies, the oversimplified, some people said teepees in there, right? That is the image on TV, is all natives lived in teepees and are from the plains, right? The Great Plains, right? That's obviously one grouping of Indigenous folks compared to the diverse dynamic, the differences of Indigenous people throughout what is called the United States today. And when you obviously associate with mascots, this will affect their education, right? Thinking about that, right? At least 1,200 high schools still have Indigenous mascots, and more than 24 in the state of Wisconsin. Okay, so this is still going on, right? This is still an effort happening. All right. I already mentioned kind of the negative view that this portrays. So let's keep on going through here. All right, so in the classroom, so this is kind of the meat and potatoes of it. So studies, so it's interesting, like you would think throughout time, throughout the 70s to now, we have advanced, which we have to certain degrees, right? There's more resources available and all that stuff. But textbooks, okay, the studies around textbooks since the 70s continue to show that Indigenous people are presented in the past, right? Again, emphasizing this people of the past. And specifically, one study in 2015 said 87% of standards and textbooks represented Indigenous people in a pre-1900 context. So again, this just compounds the idea that all Native folks are gone today, and not putting them in a modern day context. And we are seeing a shift in some of the media. We see new shows such as Reservation Dogs, Rutherford Falls, these different shows that actually have Native writers that are trying to show their story today. And oftentimes, even the representation is usually inauthentic and oversimplified, right? Not showing the complexities of the different Indigenous nations, right? You know, this picture right here, we all know the kind of the manufactured Thanksgiving story, but most people don't know the nation in which the Pilgrims actually interacted with, or the context in which that happened, right? We know it was, you know, Pilgrims and quote unquote Indians, right? And so that like lack of detail is important. And it is important just to note that Indigenous women usually are left out or silenced in general, right? You know, the two most famous Indigenous women that we usually hear about in school are Pocahontas and Sacagawea, which are important people and have important stories, but their stories aren't even, their stories are talked about in connection to settlers rather than on their own, right? And so that's really important to understand. And then the final bit before we kind of get into Act 31 is there are legislative efforts, not just in the state of Wisconsin, right? States have started to pass laws, and it's actually interesting. Wisconsin was, I don't want to say one of the first, but was on the earlier end of it. But there are 11 states, you know, as of 2019, according to the National Congress of American Indians, that actually do have some laws on the books that require the teaching of Indigenous people, usually of their state. Just like in Wisconsin, it's not just broadly Indigenous history, but is it about Indigenous people in the state of Wisconsin? And obviously, this is Act 31 in Wisconsin. All right, am I going too fast? Are we doing okay? It's always weird getting back on Zoom. Okay, so you know, it's you know, when talking about Act 31, right? It is important to say it's not just the benevolence of the lawmakers, like, no, we think this is a good idea all of a sudden, right? There's usually something that happens, and then there's a reaction and to it. And so I want to kind of talk about kind of why this happened and why we're here where we are today. So it's often dubbed the Walleye Wars, right? And we're going to talk about what that means, right? This has to do with the fishing for walleyes in northern Wisconsin in the 1980s, right? And this was often conflict between the settler population and the Anishinaabe, also referred to as the Ojibwe and Chippewa. Just good. So I'm going to probably use Anishinaabe and Ojibwe kind of interchangeably. Chippewa is more of a word that is that is used by the federal government sometimes. So it's just important. When I use those words interchangeably, I'm referencing the same people right now. All right, let's see here. All right, so I'm just going to post these up here and make some general statements. So I put this kind of bulleted list of things that happened over the course of like 10 years, right? So we, hopefully most people here know that, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, we saw a massive shift in this country in awareness, and not only awareness, but people advocating for their rights, right? And so so in the 60s and 70s there was a shift, right? Because of this, right? Because Indigenous people, the Red Power movement, started speaking up, and they always were speaking up, but there was gaining traction in policy makers. Like, it is important, like, you can look through the resistant history. You know, I say to students, anytime there was a conflict, there was always resistance. But in the 60s and 70s, there was a shift from kind of an assimilationist and a elimination policy to a self-determination era, where we started to see the shift of shifting more sovereignty, which Indigenous nations always had, but actually the federal government recognizing that sovereignty. And so it is important entering the 80s. This is the context that we're in, right? In Wisconsin, I already mentioned this, the Menominee Reservation was restored and everything. So this is the era in which they are entering. I'm not going to read out, these are just two stipulations of treaties that the United States government made with the Ojibwe. They made a number of treaties, which are legally binding documents according to the Constitution. The United States made over 300 and broke every single one of them at some point. But in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota and northern Michigan, the Ojibwe often signed treaties that gave up land. Right. And we could talk about the complications of that. But in the legally binding document is in exchange for that, we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the land that was ceded, right? That was given. And so, the layman's terms, you can hunt and fish off your reservation, right? That is, what is stated in the treaties. But obviously, the state of Wisconsin and the federal government never enforced that, right? Earlier on, maybe, but it was never fully enforced. And this is the reason that I'm talking about, just kind of get a sense there. It involves obviously Indigenous nations. I saw someone say Lac de Flambeau, but Indigenous nations not just in Wisconsin, but also in Michigan and Minnesota. And it is also important to note the Ojibwe Anishinaabe Nation, crosses the border, right? That artificial border between the U.S. and Canada did not exist, right? It was a situation where the border crossed them, right? And that happened in the southern borders as well. All right, let's see. Do we have time? Should I? Let's see. No, I'm gonna keep. This is a video. I will share this presentation so people could watch this, but I'll kind of summarize this video so we can have more time for question and Q&A. But the Treble brothers, who were from the Lakota tribe, which is in a band of the Ojibwe, they decided to do a test case, because this is how legal action happens. So they were ice fishing, and they crossed the imaginary line between the reservation and onto the off-reservation land. And they knew that the DNR guy was going to come knocking, and they asked for their permits for fishing, and they just handed a copy of the treaty, and then they were arrested, right? And so then this goes into the courts, right? And so this is their idea: is we're going to take this to the courts, and we're going to try to force the federal courts to deal with this, right? And so this is kind of the start of what is known as the Walleye Wars. So I'm just going to shift that. So there, long story short, for the court case, the Lakota win, right? Lakota in 1983, they win in the Voight decision. And I see some stuff in the chat, right? Which basically said the courts said, yes, this is what the treaties say. This is what, and a long process, just not to get into the details, was like, okay, it says that, but now it's up to the Indigenous nations and the DNR to actually, discuss this and how they're going to regulate it, right? But what happens kind of immediately after this is there are protests in northern Wisconsin, right? And I know there's some people on this call that actually were involved in fighting back against those protests, right? And these were, you can see this is a common sign: save a walleye, spear an Indian. So one of the reasons is that you are not, if you are not Ojibwe, you cannot spearfish in the state, but you can if you are an enrolled member of a Ojibwe tribe. And so there was a lot of false information given about not understanding treaties and everything. And so the disputes were happening, and long story short, people, these were dangerous. Like people were shot at and threatened. But today, and at that time, it's not like, willy-nilly, Ojibwe folks are just, hunting and fishing whenever they want, wherever they want. No, they, like any sensible community, right? Self-manage themselves, right? And it's also this like idea of possible overfishing is, the Anishinaabe Ojibwe have been there for thousands of years and haven't overfished everything. It wasn't until the settler population came. And so to this day, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission manage those permits, the seasons, all that stuff, right? And they do work with the Wisconsin DNR, but at the end of the day, they are self-management. So this is an example of modern day implementation of treaty rights. So when people say treaties are outdated, you should also say, well, then that means the Constitution's outdated as well. But this is a modern day implementation of it. And this actually, this gets us, 23 minutes in, this gets us to Act 31. What is it? What does it mean, right? This is the context where activists were like, hey, people don't know what tribal sovereignty is, don't know treaties, and there's an educational gap here. And so there was a push by activists with lawmakers to create Act 31, right? And so this was passed in 1989 and later amended in 1991. And so this, as I kind of mentioned, this was a grassroots effort to address the issues from the walleye wars and trying to remedy them. Right, and there's still disputes up north, right? We could talk about that in the Q&A. But essentially, what this requires is it requires Wisconsin students to learn Wisconsin Indigenous history in grades. I know they changed it here and there. I think it's now 4-8. I think it says 2 times within K through 8 in the 9th grade and 12th grade. So this was and it was specifically Wisconsin Indigenous history. And it also, so not it's like, oh, that's great, right? But it also requires that teachers prep programs teach this, right? Because if the teacher isn't educated, how are the students going to be educated on it, right? And so even if, like, let's say you have a license in another state and then you move to Wisconsin, you have to inevitably take some type of professional development, some type of course to fulfill that requirement. And there's some limitations to that, which I'll get to when we talk about limitations. And then it also requires the DPI to have an American Indian Studies consultant, who is currently David O'Connor, who you guys, I believe, will have next month in this meeting, which I'm sure will say even more brilliant, much more brilliant things than I will, because he's a great speaker and knows a lot. So this is the structure of Act 31, which I think, the act itself is very important, but the history leading up to it is even more important, right? To understanding that. So, just like anything, there are limitations, right? And, we can't be here, wild-eyed that everything's working great. And I already heard that there's going to be some type of action step. So one of the biggest limitations in this state, I did not grow up in Wisconsin, so I was very surprised by the school system when I moved here, how decentralized it is, right? So I live in Madison, the east side of Madison. I live 10 miles away from McFarland, and McFarland's a completely different school district, school board, which are like, there are parts of that are really great, right? But also it makes enforcement of this act very difficult, right? Because it leaves it up to those local districts. And also it only requires to have one American Indian consultant on staff. And then, so that's one limitation, right? Oftentimes, some of the teacher prep programs overly focus on the act itself, right? Rather than the history of the Indigenous nations of Wisconsin, which is a very rich history, right? We have tribes that were forced here from elsewhere, and we have tribes who have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands since time immemorial. So just some studies have shown that 4 out of 10 teachers kind of try to integrate material into their everyday lessons, right? Like that's the best practices, right? Don't just leave like, hey, we're going to talk about Native Americans. Like I teach required courses too, like U.S. history. We're trying to integrate Indigenous voices throughout the time. But then 1/3 kind of committing to only one unit, right? Saying like, this is the unit. Right, this is the unit that we're going to talk about Native Americans, right? Or worse, people not even addressing it at all, or doing it kind of oversimplified and not fully talking about the complexities. And 70% have, of teachers in some of these studies have said that they need more material, even though there's a great First Nations of Wisconsin material put together by DPI and the PBS that is there and used as an educator. And about half of teachers saying they need more professional development. Yeah, the ways I see that in there. That's a great a video series. So it is important to know, but there, you guys have some say in your local districts as well. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about some stuff that we've done in McFarland, right? We mentioned that I have an Indigenous Studies program. This is actually up here. I had some Ho-Chunk speakers come here, and Missy Tracy and Dan Brown, and then also up here is a final product of a project that a student made about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I developed the course in 2021-2022 school year. It was, welcomed, which is great. It's an elective. We had 100+ kids sign up for it for the first year, which, we are a school of about 800 kids. So that's a sizable for an elective, right? For an elective, this is, to me, just show that kids want to learn this stuff. They want to know this history. But there's also the importance of incorporating this into required courses. Like I don't have time to kind of talk about everything that we talk about Indigenous studies, but we call it studies because we talk about Indigenous knowledge systems, we talk about history, right? Kind of the hard history, the resistance, but also like representation in the mainstream. We talk about music, all that stuff, but importance of incorporating to required courses. And I know in McFarland, we are trying our best, right? And actually we're seeing people like our superintendent actually buying into this, right? I teach 9th grade U.S. history, trying to incorporate Indigenous voices throughout the entire time period that we talk about. Political science, I teach political science for juniors, making sure we incorporate tribal sovereignty and like the importance of early Indigenous relationships of this country. But I do want to mention, and I can only do this briefly because I want to leave time for questions. I've been involved in like a kind of a local community group that's kind of developed a grassroots group called Indigenous Solidarity Collective McFarland. I know there's a couple people on this call where we kind of are community members, native and non-native, school members, village board, all this kind of stuff. And really, it's been really exciting, right? We kind of came together to develop, kind of a land acknowledgement, but kind of really more importantly, building a relationship with the Ho-Chunk. There's many mounds in McFarland. And so we worked on with the Ho-Chunk Nation on starting a relationship, and we're actually working on an event that we're doing with Elliott Funmaker on September 23rd to really get the community buy into this. So really trying to show how important it is, like having it in the schools, but also in the community, right? To get everyone involved. And like we're currently working with a church that will hopefully bring a speaker here to McFarland very soon as well. And I just want to, I'll end on a couple like kind of quotes that I have. These are anonymous feedback from students. I want to emphasize that, anonymous, right? No, these aren't, but like, here from students, I like the class. I found it very informative because it broke a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions I had about Indigenous communities, as well as brought awareness to the struggles they have faced and continue to face to this day. So, and I won't read the rest, but this idea of relearning and unlearning, right? And relearning events from an Indigenous perspective. And then the final thing is just to think about when we think about education. And obviously education, and we talk about CRT, all these things are hot button issues, right? And it's really important. This is from a journal. I just want to quote this: the inclusion and exclusion of certain content and the words of which those histories and cultures are presented arguably promote a whitewashed version of history, void of multiple perspectives or viewpoints. On Indigenous U.S. settler relations, that would promote a much more and complex understanding of U.S. history. If you're learning U.S. history without Indigenous voices, you're not learning U.S. history. So I'll just end with that, and yeah, I will stop sharing my screen and leave it open for questions or comments, right? No, I'm not the only one with knowledge in this room. So yeah, I'll be quiet. And if you want to put in the chat, I can try to answer them as they come. So yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
So you talked like really, really, really fast, and I didn't get all of it. But I'm wondering, and I've wondered this before, how, like, what's the best way to find out what is actually being taught in our schools? Because I mean, I asked my grandchildren, and they're kind of, they don't give me a good answer. I mean, do we go to the school board? What's the best way to find out, what are they actually learning?
Yeah, that is a great question, right? So especially if you're not in the schools. So yeah, reach out to your school board, but I think more importantly, the school board is going to know some stuff, but they're probably going to say, hey, talk to the principal, right? Talk to the administration of the specific school, right? You're talking about. And there's usually like what's called like a scope and sequence, right? Like they can try to tell you what is being taught. One of the biggest things, I'm a social studies teacher, right? I teach history. It's usually taught to incorporate in that, and I would argue like it needs to be incorporated to more than just social studies, right? It needs to be incorporated in English, it needs to be incorporated into sciences, right? When we talk about Indigenous knowledge. So that would be first, reach out. I would say reach out to your school board and the administrations within those schools if you want to look specifically at a school. Let's see, what do you think that why do you think you had such a positive? It's interesting. So I think the question that Kathleen asked, and why I had such a positive response. I think it's twofold, right? I think one of the things was, it's 2021, 22, right? So it's important to understand the context, right? This is the time after George Floyd was murdered, right? And we had an uprising of people speaking out, right? And people questioning, right? Especially young people questioning about their histories. I know we had students asking, demanding things, right? Demanding things that maybe we weren't providing. And I think that was one of the reasons, right? Was like, oh, I don't know anything about this, right? And we don't have a large Indigenous population in our school, but we do have, we have a number of them, and they took the course too, right? And so that's really I think is important. Oh yeah, do you get any resistance from parents? Fortunately, I was assuming I would get a lot more. I have not. I have gotten, I shouldn't say have not gotten any, right? You get your occasional email and everything. And I think this is where, like with the local control of school districts, it can be helpful, right? If the school district, like my school district, has like, various anti-racist, like not bills, but resolutions passed, right? So when I'm doing that, I have an administration that can support me, right? And can be like, hey, this is what you guys said, right? And I'm just doing it, right? And so, but you get your emails, you get some comments, right? But I also don't live in I live in Madison, so I don't know if I'm not like involved in some of the small town of backroom conversations of some sort. Yeah, so there was some resistance, but not. And I think part of it is because of those anti-racist resolutions, right? It was kind of like it would be hard for the school board to say no to the course if my department bought into it and everything like that, and they had these resolutions as well. Oh, great. I see. What types of resources do you use in your class? So one of the books that we use is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for young people. So there's also an adult version. It's by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Amazing book. And it talks through, we use a lot of resources outside of that, right? No, this is just like kind of a book that we use on and off. We actually use a lot of music, right? Actually, I start every class with music as the kids are coming in, right? And so it's like, and it's Indigenous artists and of all stripes, right? Punk rock, traditional, hip hop, classical, like all these different types of musicians. And one documentary, I show a couple documentaries, but one I would suggest everyone to check on out, and I will type it in here. It's called Real Injun. I kind of start out with this documentary. It's all about the depiction of Indigenous people in film over the years, and it kind of helps students really start to just think about their own thoughts. Like I had a student who's like, had this reflection at the end of the year, because it was like, I grew up, my dad loved cowboy and Indian films, and I had this certain subconscious image, right? And like I didn't even know it, right? Because it was just there. And so yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share materials that I have, but those are some of the resources off the top of my head. And there's a great organization called Wisconsin Indian Education Association, which they do a lot to support Indigenous educators. I am not Indigenous, but educating Indigenous folks, but also non-Indigenous folks about this stuff as well. Okay, let's see. I see some what gets tested. It's taught. Okay, I'm just sifting through all this stuff. Thanks for using music. Yeah, for sure. And I think, thinking about curriculum, I kind of see the tested and incentivized robust Act 31. It seemed more of a comment, but I think that I suggest everyone to go to just Google Wisconsin First Nations. It is an amazing resource that I think many teachers don't have. And I also think there's some systematic issues, right? If teachers don't know about this stuff, oftentimes we don't have time, right? We don't have time in our day to educate ourselves unless we're like working overtime, which every teacher works overtime, right? No, that's no doubt about that. And so I feel fortunate that I came in with my experience, right? And I found that that's a problem in my school, right? People still kind of look at me, which is like fine, but it's also they should be looking at themselves, right? To be educated on their own mark. So someone just said, can I have access to your PowerPoint? I will put it back in the chat. I did just put in the chat, but I will put it back there in the chat as well. Let's see, any other questions here? Let's see. I see there, yeah, there's a hand raised. I'm not sure if that was an accident or wanted to say something. Maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. Oh yeah, so it's great. Someone mentioned Mark Charles. So I actually just got off the phone today, working with someone with a local church in McFarland, trying to talk about bringing him in. Mark Charles, who, just those who don't know, talks a lot about the doctrine of discovery, which I do have a couple lesson plans I do in class about, which is a doctrine, a doctrine that's still used in the Supreme Court, which basically is like, the simplistic of it is, if you come across a nation, people that are not Christian, they have rights to occupy the land but not own the land, right? And so this is something that is still a legal doctrine actually in the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court justices started using in 1820s, and most recently I think used in a 2005 case as well. But yeah, Mark Charles, look him up. He did run for president. I saw someone posted that, but we're looking to hopefully bring him into the McFarland community to speak to this, both in the schools as well as some of the churches. I am not familiar with Citizens of a Stolen Land, but I will look that up. Thank you. Oh yeah, that's a new. I just looked it up. I know that's a new book that recently came out, which it's on my reading list. The cover I recognize as well. Which, for those who don't know, this is a book that's about Ho-Chunk history. So those of you in the Madison area should definitely check that out. Any other questions? I know we're reaching the end, so I'm sure there's like a call to action of some sort here at the end. So maybe one more question if anyone has any.
Yeah, I just mentioned that it's a little blurry, but Ada Deer has a book that was recently published about 3 years ago.
Yep.
It's called Making a Difference. So if anybody's interested.
Yeah. It's a great book, just so people know.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. This was terrific. I mean, you really packed a lot into a short time there, and we certainly really appreciate it. I do believe we'll also be emailing everybody a copy of Brian's PowerPoint if you didn't catch it in the chat there. So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate you with us tonight. And we'll pass the ball back to Rachel, who will do our call to action then.
All right, thank you. We're actually going to get a little bit of a double whammy on that call to action. We know you're up for it. One is a more of a short-term call to action, something that can be accomplished a little more quickly than the other. And that is just what was mentioned at the beginning of our evening and came up in the questions that Brian so wonderfully answered. And that is connecting with your local school district to find out what's going on. What, when, where, who is what's being taught. Great suggestions around that, contacting school board and or administrators. So thanks for that, Brian. The second call to action, we're giving you a little in advance because it will probably take a bit more work. I'm just going to say it. We're challenging you to teach the truth. There's actually a week. Did you know that? Teach the Truth, Wisconsin. It's a week in October 8th through 14th. You can find lots of information on this week of teaching the truth on a website that we'll put in the chat. I can do that. But I can't do that and talk at the same time. So you're gonna have to give me a second. Here we go, it's coming. Maybe. There we go. No, that's not it. Huh. Thank you. Someone beat me to it. Rick. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have this new computer and the mouse is super creeping me out. So there has been a Wisconsin Teach the Truth Week for a number of years, and each year has a bit of a focus, a recommended focus. And this year, our recommended focus around teaching the truth is about holidays. We all know that there are many holidays that have been very whitewashed. They are not accurate representations of the history, or maybe they're just one version of the history that has is coming before that actual holiday. So one of the ways that you can participate, either as a congregation or a community group, or even a small group of committed grassroots folks, is to choose a holiday and research its actual history and create a way to share that with others. Another way to teach the truth that we're suggesting is to think about dates or events that are not currently holidays, but that would be wonderful dates or events to celebrate. Dates or events that lift up stories of oppression, a resistance to oppression, and victories over injustice. Either of those would be wonderful things to create some kind of learning experience for others. And we challenge you to teach the truth during that week of October 8th through 14th. Now, that's not all, because if you will send us the date of whatever you've decided to share in your community and the topic, we have a calendar that we will put that on so that it is out there, right? And if you will send us a picture, a video, a little write-up, or even a text message of your event, that will be posted on our Facebook page. So we can, those ripples will go on and on around teaching the truth. If you go to that website, there's, again, all kinds of information, including a Teach the Truth toolkit. That toolkit is going to provide tips, ideas, templates, and you're also going to be able to find some examples of events that were created and shared with us in prior years of Teach the Truth. So, challenge is on. Teach the truth and let us know about it so that we can share it with others. Finally, before we close with a prayer, I want to give you a heads up about the rest of our webinars for this year. Someone asked what the date was of the part 2 of this 2-part series, and that's September 12th. We'll be joined by David O'Connor. He is the one and only American Indian Studies consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Instruction. He is just burning rubber all around the state, doing trainings and teaching and sharing information. So we're very excited to have him join us on September 12th. On October 10th, we're going to be joined by Representative Francesca Hong, and she will be sharing information on the Asian American and Pacific Islanders Education Bill, the AEI Education Bill. And finally, this year, on November 14th, we are thrilled that Professor Gloria Latson-Billings will join us and will be sharing her work on critical race theory and the backlash from white Christian nationalists, and also be sharing some information on her wonderful work on culturally relevant pedagogy. So be on the lookout for more information, including registration for those events. We will be taking the month of December off. So you can look forward to some great new webinars coming up in the new year. And with that,
thank you, Rachel. And before we go to our closing prayer, so I ask everybody to put something in the chat. What are you taking away from this tonight? What are you taking away? What's something you learned? What's something you thought? What's something you want to commit to do as a result of being here for the last hour? Okay. Allies need to talk to local principals. Some action I can take, I can talk to my school district. Look through new resources shared, a nudge to talk to the school system, stay connected to public schools. Happy to discover religious groups focused on social justice. Teach the Truth, Saturday, October 8th, Prairie du Sac. Lots of resources. Check with the neighborhood school. Create a land acknowledgement statement for my church. Excellent. Focusing on social justice with my UU congregation. Great, and you can keep putting things in there. Questioning the fourth grade curriculum of my granddaughter. Excellent. Original people similarities. You can keep putting things in there, and we will turn it over to Ann Lacey, who is going to offer a closing prayer for us this evening.
Hey, and this isn't really a closing prayer. It is a closing poem from Joy Harjo, who was the U.S. Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2022, and she is a member of the Muskogee Nation. It is called Eagle Poem. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you, and know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circle the blue sky in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born, and die soon within a true circle of motion. Like eagle rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. And I add, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ann. Again, big thank you to Brian for being with us tonight. And many, many, many thanks to Peter for lots of work over many, many months. Thank you all. See you in September.